My name is Joel Salmadal, and
My name is Nelson Graves, and we'll be going straight into our panel on the updates in the Quebec immigration. So Quebec is unique among Canadian provinces in that they are able to select their own applicants for permanent residency. For those applying for permanent residency and plan to reside long-term in Quebec, they must obtain the CSQ, or the Certificat de Sélection du Québec, in order to then apply at the federal level for permanent residency. Historically, the PEQ program, or the Programme d'Expérience du Québec, and the Skilled Worker Program have been pathways for receiving the CSQ. The PEQ is particularly important for international graduates of Quebec universities, as this provides a specific pathway for students to apply for permanent residency after graduation. On October 31st, these two key immigrant streams were frozen, and these freezes are set to last until June 30th of next year. During the freeze, the MIFI, the government body responsible for processing and reviewing immigration applications, also known as the Ministère de l'Immigration, de la Francisation et de l'Intégration, désolé pour mon français, they have announced a freeze of these. And so we're going to go in to talk a bit about this with two guests today. Today we have François Crépeau, who is a Canadian lawyer and full professor at the McGill Faculty of Law. He's a former, he is the former director of the McGill Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism, and has been a member of a number of editorial boards, including the Journal of Refugee Studies, the International Refugee Law, and many more. We also have Claire Launay, who is the current president of the organization Le Québec c'est nous aussi, which roughly translates into English as We Are Quebec Too. The LQCNA was founded in 2020 when there was also big forms to the PEQ program, and several members began organizing online, and this eventually formed into the LQCNA. Since they have advocated for immigrants' rights in Quebec by participating in government proceedings related to immigration, by organizing actions to shed light on the issues faced by people without status, asylum seekers, international students, temporary workers, and anyone who is not a citizen here. So welcome to all. I hope that was a sufficient introduction. Joel, would you like to go into some questions?
yes, of course. And just to preface, the News Collective does generally maintain a neutral and objective perspective on all of the topics we covered. So we thought it was important today to preface that both Nelson and I are actually former students in Quebec. And so at times throughout this, we might share some of our own personal experiences with the immigration process. And so, we just wanted to let all the listeners know that. Welcome again to our two panel members, and thank you both for joining us today. I just wanted to start with François. I know that you've done a lot of research and work in the field of international migration around the world. And over recent months, we've seen in Quebec and across Canada that there's been a slight shift, we could say, in the general rhetoric regarding immigration that's become more critical of immigration. And from your research and work, generally, what are the causes, what are the driving forces of this type of rhetoric when it does emerge?
Yeah, the driving force is always electoral mood in democracies, and the mood of the population if you're not in a democracy. We have to understand that migration policies are very specific in that they are made by non-migrants, the politicians, for non-migrants, the electorate. Migrants are not asked their opinion. They're not asked to contribute. Their voice is not heard. They are the object of the of those policies. They're not a subject who is important in negotiating the policies. The policies can go in whichever direction the politicians feel that the electorate wants them to go, whether it's pro-immigration, contra-immigration. I mean, it doesn't matter. Migrants are not part of the debate. And we have to understand that historically, no minoritized population has ever been able to have their rights recognized. None of them have had their rights served on a silver platter. They had to fight for them against the majorities. And they fought with what? With the right to vote. They first had to acquire it, and then they had to fight for, all the other rights, that their influence on who the politicians are going to be elected will work towards that. So they can punish or reward politicians. Migrants, and we see that women, for example, who've had the right to vote for 80 to 100 years, still have to fight in 2018 on sexual harassment, and they have to fight to bring that into the social conversation. And they've had the right to vote for many, many decades. Migrants don't even have the right to vote. It's not even discussed that migrants should have the right to vote. They should in many cases, but let's not talk about that. They're not there to discuss policies. They don't give the population their real life appreciation of what's happening to them. They're not asked, and they're just the object. They're told what to do. And for many migrants who are in a precarious situation, in precarity, and that includes undocumented migrants, temporary migrant workers, international students, etc., who have a very precarious status in Canada, which can end tomorrow if they fail their exams, or if they are discovered and when they're undocumented, or if they're fired when they're a temporary migrant worker with a single employer. That precarity takes away their voice, because they will not do anything that could threaten their status or their presence in Canada. They have often debts because of the migration trajectory. They have duties to their families. They have to send home money. And so defending their rights is not their first priority. Their usual strategy is to move on when their rights are trampled, trying to find a new employer, trying to move on to something else and stay in the country so that they can fulfill their duties towards their family and reimburse debts when that is the case. So policies can change from one day to the next, 180 degrees. There's no one to tell. And we have to understand that I, as a citizen, let's say I'm a generic citizen, I don't vote on migration issues. I will vote on access to healthcare for me and my parents, or access to school for my children and quality of schooling. And I will, vote on potholes in Montreal. And, there are many reasons to vote. And for a citizen, migration policies are simply not an issue. The only electorate that is mobilizable on migration issues is the anti-immigration electorate, that 10, 15, 20% or more, maybe south of the border, who are against immigration for all sorts of reasons, often stereotypical reasons, but they're against immigration, and they can be mobilized to vote. But people who are generally in favor of migration don't vote on that. Mm-hmm. So there's no pushback against any discourse which is anti-immigration, that they're all rapists or drug dealers or whatever. Mm-hmm. There's no pushback. I mean, yes, NGOs will work against that, lawyers will work against that, some of them, but there's no political pushback. Even politicians that we think would be in favor of migration will not take the risk of being of losing the next election by doing something which can damage their political career. And we have to understand that electoral democracy is the best system we've ever invented. So electoral incentive is actually what works, except that for migrants it doesn't, because they don't work.
Yeah,
they don't vote. Sorry.
Thank you, François. Yeah. No, that was very helpful. And I think I'd like to ask Claire a bit more about specifically the Quebec context, and about maybe what have you been seeing as the rise of anti-immigration rhetoric has come to the forefront here in Quebec specifically, and then also maybe something about the specific precarities that Quebec students may face with this new change.
All right, well, thank you for having me, first of all. I couldn't agree more with what Professor Crépeau said already, and I'd like to just add, like, the Minister of Immigration, Roberge, said it himself to justify those freezes. He said, Quebecers are worried about the numbers of immigration. He didn't say the numbers, the data is worrying for such and such reason, because he doesn't have that data. He mentioned the infamous capacité d'accueil. That's sort of...
Can I just, could you expand on that, the capacité d'accueil?
Sure. So the capacité d'accueil, which I guess would be like the welcoming capacity of Quebec, is that sort of strawman argument that the government keeps using to justify decreases in immigration. They keep saying, oh, we just don't have the capacity to welcome this many permanent residents, this many temporary workers, and they will use, for example, like shortages in housing or issues in the healthcare system or the education system and put the blame on immigrants. Because it's much easier to blame immigrants, which, as Professor Crépeau said, don't have the right to vote, as it is to own for your own shortcomings in terms of public policy. So they're sort of the easy scapegoat. And so that's a shortcut that the CAQ likes to take as often as they can. But we see more and more with now the Parti québécois, the PQ, rising in polls as well, that they're also taking on that rhetoric. So we now have two parties really taking on that anti-immigration rhetoric, and it makes it even harder for us, exactly the few NGOs on the ground and the few voices of immigrants on the ground to do our work, because it's almost, now we don't even question it. It's sort of accepted as a given. It's sort of like the decline of the French language in Quebec. They've said it so many times that now it's been accepted as truth, even though the data doesn't actually quite support that. So now they've said many times that immigrants are the cause of the housing crisis or education or healthcare issues. And they've said it so many times that it's now accepted. It's no longer problematic. It's no longer seen as extreme for a party to say those things. And in turn, we are considered radical for trying to show the data that actually doesn't support those claims.
Can I, sorry, just to jump in, can you tell us a little bit more about that data? Like, what data are you referring to?
About the French language?
Yeah, or just like how like the rhetoric isn't lining up with the actual...
Well, with the French language, it's particularly interesting because the data point that the government keeps using is one of the language spoken at home. But I mean, if you're an immigrant, by definition, you're going to speak your own language at home, and that shouldn't be a problem. And I mean, I'm originally from France, so francophone. I don't even check that box because I speak English with my partner. So am I responsible for the decline of the French language? It's not a salient data point, but it's the one they keep bringing up. Additionally, they keep sort of, I mean, that was more like towards the last year, but they kept blaming temporary residents for the decline of the French language. But guess who brought those temporary residents? The Quebec government. Yeah. So it's just, we keep seeing the Quebec government creating those issues and then blaming immigrants for them. It's kind of a preposterous cognitive dissonance that we have to just deal with every day now for the past few years now.
Yeah, and I think it's important that you brought up this sort of straw man of the loss of the French language, because we're based at McGill, primarily English University. Also, Concordia has been a target of this. And recently, there was kind of a change in how the PEQ works for English language, or people who receive the majority of their education in English. So could you speak maybe a bit about the specifics of maybe the university, like how that's playing a role in maybe these immigration choices?
Well, we asked the government about that because we couldn't quite understand. So we actually did a request of information to get the data on how many people through McGill, Concordia, all the biggest Anglophone institutions in Quebec, how many actually got through the PEQ, because you do have to pass a French language test for it. Yeah. So it's not like these were Anglophones sneaking in or something. And the numbers it was a few hundreds per year. And we specifically asked the numbers of students who didn't speak French when they had arrived in Quebec, because these were the ones who were going to be excluded from the new version of the PEQ. It was a few hundreds, and so we went to the government and we asked them, this only concerns a few hundred people per year. People who came here without speaking French, who took the time to learn French on top of a full-time study load, because you have to stay full-time as an international student. And you're closing the door for them for permanent residency. Why? And what we were told was, we just really want to incentivize people to go to the Francophone universities. And we were a little bit stunned that they said it so bluntly, that it's clearly a move against Anglophone institutions.
No, they're not trying to hide it at all.
No.
Mm-hmm. And one more thing is that they've cut the funding for French language courses for immigrants.
Oh, exactly.
Which is, they're complaining that they don't speak French and they don't offer courses to learn French, which is stunning.
Yeah. I think the other aspects of this is like a lot of the times the rhetoric has been that with making these immigration policy changes, they will eventually have like positive effects on other sectors. So like it will like the authorities have argued that dropping the immigration threshold will lead to like less pressure on social services, on healthcare in Quebec, and it will help in combating the general cost of living crisis that's going on at the moment. Would you say, like, I feel like these are similar points that are generally made when migration policies, when new migration policies are introduced, and would you say that they are generally successful in achieving these stated aims? Or
well, there are several elements here. First, you have to remember that the CAC says that they're going to reduce the number of immigrants, but employers think that the number of immigrants is too low. They've asked for 100,000 permanent residents in Quebec every year, which means that there are jobs for immigrants, which means that if Quebec and Ottawa do not offer the kind of mobility mechanisms that migrants need and employers want, other people will. And they're called smugglers, and they're called whatever. But these people will, many people will come to fill those jobs. We already have anywhere between 750,000 and 1 million undocumented migrants in Canada. We don't know the exact statistics, but it's probably in that ballpark, evaluation, who are all working because otherwise they don't eat. They have no social, safety net whatsoever. And they are there because employers offer jobs to them. And this is now a strategy everywhere to reduce labor costs.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sure employers are usually very aware of
everyone is aware. Yeah. If you go in the district of Chabanel in Montreal, you have those big blocks with large manufacturing things at every level, 600 sewing machines, for example. Many of those are staffed by undocumented migrants. Everyone knows that. No one wants to touch that because the capacity of, first of all, these businesses to produce is at stake. They have low profit margins usually. If you raise the labor cost by empowering the workers to, for example, unionize and negotiate their collective agreement, they won't be able to cope, and many of these businesses will disappear, or they will raise the prices for their goods and services, and the consumers won't be happy. And in both cases, you talk about consumers and employers and entrepreneurs, both are voters. Migrants are not. So no one in politics has an interest in raising labor costs by protecting migrants or by doing anything. So it might be, I don't think it's a strategy on the part of the CAC. I don't think it is, but it's become part of a global strategy to maintain labor costs very low for jobs that citizens will not take at those labor conditions. Citizens would work the fields if you offered $40 an hour. Now you can imagine the price of the basket of strawberries if you paid workers. But that means that we have a loss of productivity, which is colossal, because we could mechanize agriculture like we've mechanized other and diminish the number of the 3D dangerous, dirty, and difficult jobs altogether. By mechanizing in several sectors, we would lose jobs for sure, but that would create other jobs. And we wouldn't need as many migrants. And migrants know that. Migrants are not stupid. They go to countries where jobs are in offer, either underground or officially. They would prefer officially, but they go underground if they need to. And many countries, and that's true north and south, it's true in Canada, in Germany, in South Africa, in Malaysia, they go for underground labor markets because there are jobs. They can survive in those labor markets. They can send money home. And we have that. It's structural to our economy, and no politician has an interest to change the thing. So this is probably what's going to happen. Reducing the number of permanent residents, of people who can work, means that more people will enter illegally and fill those jobs because employers need them.
Yeah, and that kind of brings me to a question that's been, that I've been thinking about and others have. Like, why now specifically? What sort of indication? Well, I'll ask Claire because I believe your organization had recently had a meeting with the MIFI. And did they offer any sort of like reasoning as to why now of all times?
Well, the answers of the MIFI were very, how should I put this? Well, diplomatic might be it, but they made it clear that this was a decision from the top, so that they were applying the policy, but that they weren't necessarily responsible for them. So let's give them some grace. Why now? Well, we saw that this came out on October 31st, and the day after, the minister had to sort of explain why we, quote unquote, suddenly had 70,000 permanent residents in Quebec when they had supposedly planned for less, which, I mean, any person who knows anything about immigration could have told you these were the numbers we're going to get. This was absolutely not a surprise. But it seems, considering they didn't take time to consult anybody, because we also asked them that, they didn't consult any university about the freezes. This was clearly a decision made in panic. They knew that the media was going to get their hands on those numbers fast, and they wanted to get there faster. When to show, look, we're taking action, we're decreasing immigration. But I think one of the things I want to insist on is that they're decreasing the numbers of permanent residents. And this is something, a bit of a pet peeve of mine, because I do see this in media all the time. It's permanent residents being described as newcomers, where very few of them are.
Oh, exactly.
Very few people who get PR are newcomers. They've been here for years on some temporary status.
2019 personally.
Exactly. It took me 7 years to get PR as well. So the thing is, so they can say, oh, look, we've decreased the quotas, and I guess Quebecers who don't want to look behind the headlines will be satisfied with that rhetoric. But the reality is there's still a lot of people, like Professor Crépeau was saying, who are on temporary status and now without pathways to permanent residency. So at best, from the point of view of the government, of course, at best, they will leave the province, leaving behind jobs and all the issues mentioned. And at worst, they will stay and fall without status. In either ways, this doesn't really solve any of the problems that are supposed to be solved by that decrease in permanent residency. And the thing is, because they'd made that decision so abruptly, I mean, not that they ever really showed strong care towards the immigrants they were affecting, but a lot of people, they have their work permit, for example, ending at a specific date, before June 2025. Now they have no pathway to PR. And by the way, they said the freeze was until June 2025. What the MIFI told us was there was no guarantee that those programs would come back in the same form in June 2025, that this was going to depend on the consultation of immigration that's going to take place in the spring. So there's no guarantee. There's no... You can't just tell yourself, fine, I'll just wait 8 months and I'll apply through this program at this time. There's no guarantee that that program will still be here by then, because the PEQ, our organization has existed for 4 years. We've seen 4 different versions of the PEQ program. The PRTQ became the PSTQ for the skilled workers program. Yes. It hasn't even had time to come into effect that it's already on freeze. Yeah. So it's really hard to trust the government with their promises, and they're trying to de-dramatize the situation, telling people this is just a freeze. But how do we believe them at this point? It's really hard to trust their word.
Mm-hmm. One element we have to understand is that most government policies are strategically planned. Not that politicians always follow the plan, but you know, the highways we're building now were probably designed at the end of the 50s or, you know, in the 60s. Not that they were built anytime soon, but, you know, we follow approximately what was done for building suburbs, for infrastructure, for energy, for schools, for hospitals. There is strategic planning. Migration, Canada is probably the best country in the world by planning permanent residence for 3 years. That's the strategic planning we do. In other fields, you plan for 20 years, 30 years. Here we plan for 3 years, and then we react emotionally to whatever mood the electorate is in, and we emphasize that mood in order to gain electoral traction. I mean, it's really a pity that, for example, saying that we could not know that so many people would come. This is a government dedicated to business. They know that business wants to hire. They know that these entrepreneurs need the manpower to do whatever business they do. You can plan this. You can collect the information, organize it, and you can say, yes, we're going to decrease slightly this year, or augment next year, but you can do that over the long period. Demographically, we never hear, what is the demographic goal of Quebec. There are many reasons why the population should need to grow, maybe a bit slowly, but etc. But there are many reasons that should be factored into a strategic planning, not simply the mood of the electorate, because today this all started when the federal government announced 500,000 PR, permanent residents, in the next 2 years. That was 2 years ago. They announced 500,000. As long as it was 490,000, it was okay. Right. Suddenly, 500,000 made the headlines around the world, and then people panicked. And to me, this is the kind of reaction which shows that there's absolutely no strategic planning, and you just go by the mood of the electorate. And that's a tragedy for Quebec, for Quebecers, but also for migrants, for sure.
No, absolutely. Well, I'm just looking at the time, and we have about 1 minute left. So I think I just want to quickly ask Claire, does your organization offer any sort of support for people who might be in sort of a sticky situation, or you may be able to direct people to
help us
to help? Yeah.
I wish I could say yes. We are strictly advocating, like we do advocacy as a service. So what we can do, though, if you follow us on social media, is we can help you mobilize and try to apply pressure to the government, or at least get our voices heard. We've been making quite some noise in the media already. We're trying to just sort of balance the conversation so we don't only hear the government side. But there is no easy solution right now to international students' issues. The best we can do is just make ourselves heard.
Exactly.
And where can people find your different pages?
We're everywhere, except TikTok.
Okay.
We haven't gotten to that
okay.
yet. We're a little too millennial. But Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn even. Le Québec, c'est nous aussi.
Okay.
All right. Thank you so much.
Yes. Thank you both for coming on the panel today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for inviting me as well.